Over the past many years, United Way of Chennai's Markets and Economy event has brought together industry leaders to share their unique insights and perspectives on macroeconomic trends, investment landscape, and capital markets with our audience. Tonight, we are privileged to have two exceptional keynote speakers in our midst. Mr. Neelkanth Mishra is Chief Economist at Axis Bank since 2023. After 2 decades at Credit Suisse, where he was co-head of Asia-Pacific Strategy and India Head of Research, Mr. Mishra is also a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Considered one of the foremost experts on global economy, he was part of the Advisory Council to the 15th Finance Commission and has been an advisor to committees appointed by the Government of India. Over the years, he has consistently been recognized as one of the top analysts in India in investor polls. We are honored to invite Mr. Neelkanth Mishra to share his perspectives on global and domestic economic transitions and India's macroeconomic path.
Thank you. Good evening. Quite an honor to be speaking to you here. Can the slides be loaded? So there is a lot of news flow and chatter, and while preparing for this session and interacting with the organizers, I mean, we discovered that most of us, the morning routine has changed to wake up and check Twitter on what's the next thing Mr. Trump has thrown at us. So there is a lot of news flow, and I'll discuss some of the implications of the changes that are happening globally. But I must say and emphasize that the drivers of economic growth, or the major drivers of economic growth in India over the next year or two, are primarily domestic. So you will see Mr. Trump doing what he is very good at. He's a very good politician. There's a lot of muzzle velocity. He will keep throwing news flow. He'll keep attracting attention to himself. But the drivers of domestic growth are all in India. Now, globally, you can see that growth is expected to be about 3.2%. This is IMF, is as consensus as it gets. But there is significant forecast uncertainty. So there are two things to take away from that. The first is that growth is far lower than it used to be. It is significantly lower than what it used to be in 2004 to 8, when China was really accelerating. It is now below what it used to be pre-COVID, and now there are downside risks because of some of the things that we will discuss. But there is significant forecast uncertainty. And so what you can see is that the global growth rate is actually coming off. So what you see on the left here is that global growth, the compounded annualized rate, growth rate, has actually been coming off. What the exact implications of the industrial policy action that we are seeing, we will discover over time, and I will try to give you a framework through which to think about it. But what is very clear, if you see the chart on the right, that all of this trade, tariffs, and is driving significant uncertainty, and the biggest victim of that is investments. So if anyone is thinking of starting off a new factory, frankly, they will prefer to hold back and see where this thing settles. Whether, I mean, who's setting up, how much tariffs on whom, and frankly, what we are seeing right now is the start of what is going to be a very turbulent phase. Now, what you see here is that industrial policy actions are starting off. Trade tariffs are only part of the story. So what you see on the left is there's been significant expansion of the number of industrial policies. The tariffs had been falling very steadily since the Second World War, and now finally they've started to rise. What is also important to remember is that in industrial policies, tariffs are only one very small part. So what you see in this table, you don't have to read everything. The whole objective is to show that everything from export subsidies to tax credits to investment, FDI incentives, to labor subsidies, product standards. Today, Arvind wrote about how quality control orders in India are becoming a big tool to prevent imports. So there are many, many tools that are likely to be used, and trade tariffs are only just one of them. And we are seeing And we are likely to see countries use more and more of these as the trade war continues to build up. So people, as they start distrusting each other, uh, uh, the desire is to retaliate. Now, you must have seen Mark Carney, who has his own political ambitions in Canada, demanding that Canada now impose duties on the US, which will really hurt. So, so you are likely to see that. I think national pride, etc., everything will come into question. The background to this is very much the left-hand side chart, which is the line which is snaking up is China's industrial output. So I've been writing about how China equals China plus one. China is over-indexed on every single industry which is growing rapidly today. So maybe other than biotech, in every single thing, even in biotech, their patents are actually rising very rapidly. So solar panels, energy storage, electric vehicles, they are 60 to 90% of global capacity and global production. So if they are today at 35% of global production in aggregate, and these are the segments that are going to grow rapidly, tell you what, in 3 years, 5 years' time, their share of global manufacturing is going to be even higher. So this is the root cause of what is happening. They have themselves now figured out that, in fact, their own companies have stopped investing. There is so much of excess capacity. So you can see on the right that credit to industry, which was growing very rapidly. So as they moved credit away from real estate, so this is also very existential for them. When they want to sustain growth, they were earlier building houses. When they found that houses are for living, not for speculating, they started shifting this credit away to industry, and that's what has happened to the rest of the world. So this is something that is very deep-rooted. It's not going to be wished away by some people saying that tariffs are bad. Now, if you go back to the 1930s and look at the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, just look at the pace at which they increased. So this was after the first phase of globalization, where you saw tariffs fall very sharply, and then this was the era of protection. So let me go forward and show you this chart as well. This is what was happening to currencies. Look at the right-hand side, this axis. Currencies were moving by 50 to 100%. And I'm not saying this is going to happen again, but when trade wars really start, when countries start to attempt to hurt each other economically, they start using a lot more tools than just import tariffs. Already in some of the chat groups, people are starting to talk about the RMB falling, and we'll discuss that. But when you think about tariffs as a whole, just focus on these two charts. The left-hand side chart is on import volumes. The orange line is global on both, that is exports, this is imports. The purple line is US, and it's all indexed at 100 in November 16. You can see that excluding the US, there has been barely any import growth in the world. And similarly, excluding China, there has been barely any export growth in the world. So it is therefore quite natural that despite the US imposing tariffs on China, the value add, so what is happening is that the share of imports coming from China has fallen. So it was at 22% at the peak, it's now at 13%. But the problem is that the value add in the imports in the US that comes from China has not fallen. So you have Vietnam for rebadging, you have Malaysia for rebadging, you have Mexico for rebadging, and therefore, when you have a very deep-rooted economic advantage that China has on the manufacturing side, and you have excessive fiscal deficits in the US, it is very natural that US will have high trade deficits and China will have large trade surpluses. And therefore, some of these things cannot be wished away with tariffs, which makes me even more worried that when tariffs stop working, what is really going to happen? So this is, there will be a temptation for countries to use currency. When you hear the US president talking about a crypto reserve, it is nothing but an attempt to devalue the dollar. His problem is that the harder he works with higher tariffs, the more the dollar appreciates. The more people become uncertain about the US, the more the dollar appreciates. And therefore, he has to somehow find a way to devalue the dollar. And therefore, he is going to desperate measures and talking about strategic crypto reserves and all of that. Now, these are things that would have been unthinkable even, I would say, yesterday. but now we have to start building into our framework as to how rapidly things can change. Now, currency devaluations also by themselves do not work. So what you see is that in the Plaza Accord, when the Japanese were forced to appreciate their currency by 40%, it didn't really change the US deficits. Because economically, it is your fiscal deficit, it is the macroeconomic balances which drive whether you are having imports or exports. And this is something that I think the Trump administration is deliberately ignoring because it's inconvenient politics. There are problems, I think, across the world which have been caused by China's growth, but I don't think these are the right solutions. But irrespective of that, this is something that is likely to happen. The RMB, which I think everyone fears will be forced to depreciate. Trump wants it to appreciate against the dollar, but so what we are trying to show here is that RMB itself has significant vulnerabilities. You would think that a country which persistently reported current account surpluses would have a very large pool of assets, international assets. Its yield on international assets would be very high. It's actually the opposite. China has seen $1.4 trillion of capital flight in the last decade, and therefore its primary income, so it pays much more on its international liabilities than it earns on its international assets. And therefore, their balance of payments because of outbound FDI, just like post the Plaza Accord, the Japanese had to spend a lot on foreign capacity. The Chinese now have to start doing that. They are already doing that, $200 billion being invested every year abroad. Inbound FDI has collapsed to nearly zero. Their interest rates are 1.5%. US interest rates are 4.5%. Capital flight through the trade credit channel. So the RMB is already quite vulnerable. And therefore, it is very easy for the Chinese government to allow it to depreciate to counter the threat of tariffs. The world, and you must be seeing that our commerce minister is in the US, bilateral trade agreements. So you would think that when the global trade is fragmenting, global trade to GDP has flattened out, why are regional trade agreements? What you see on the left is the number of regional trade agreements. So bilateral agreements and small regional agreements will become much more common. This means suboptimal solution. As we all know, global optima are better than local optima, or a combination of local optima. But without the US, I don't think multilateralism is going to work. So we are going to head towards a lot more of regional alliances. What can India do? I think if the US arm twists us into lower import duties, frankly, I would be very happy with that. Because lower import duties, they maybe seem to be hurting in the near term, but if done judicially, I think there is a significant productivity advantage that comes through. So India has among the highest import tariffs in the world, and if in the process of negotiating with the US, we are forced to bring some of them down, I don't think that will be a bad outcome. India, we need to focus a lot more on ease of doing business. As the US shifts from tight fiscal, loose monetary policy to a tight monetary, loose fiscal policy, cost of capital globally is going to be high. There is a lot more of competition. There is a lot less of capital to go around. You can see how inflows into India have already started to slow. It's a beauty parade that just got tougher, and therefore we need to work even harder on attracting global capital. I think it is very important to start looking at the world very differently. As I said, US capital is at 4.5%, Chinese capital is at 1.5%. It's not as freely available. The Chinese, frankly, do not want to really invest in India in strategic sectors. But judicially, we can tap into new areas for capital, new markets, as the geographical center of gravity starts to shift, and which is frankly why the US and Europe are now breaking apart, something that was taken as cemented after the Second World War. Actually, something that went back for 200 years is now breaking apart because the center of gravity for the world has shifted, and something that we should focus on as well. We should also focus on the advantage that comes. So you will see, I mean, you don't have to go through the details, but there are significant numbers of jobs, significant amount of dollars that can come from exporting people. As the demographically challenged Western Europe or North Asian countries desire workers, and they are struggling with illegal immigrants, I think this is an opportunity that India can take advantage of. Trump's policies, I think I'll quickly run through 2-3 of those. One, I think on the fiscal side, the problem is that the US has been running pro-cyclical fiscal policies, meaning that they have high fiscal deficit when unemployment rate is low. This is very dangerous. And as the growth challenges start to come through, I think we will see the US throwing significant uncertainty and turmoil at the financial market. So this is something that people have been talking about. These are things like, an asteroid hitting. You don't know when and where it's going to hit, but it is something to be very worried about. The second, I think, problem that is going to come through in the US is they are claiming now that immigration has come down by 87%. Frankly, when the US growth was surprising on the upside, it was partly because of fiscal stimulus and partly because of a lot of immigrants, because they were getting a lot more workers. Now they are going after both of them, and this is something that is likely to go through a lot of negative surprise. The only positive is, in addition to AI, which can drive a lot of productivity growth over time, that they are also focusing on deregulation. So everything from financial services to energy to healthcare, drug discovery, all of those processes, they are starting to cut down on flab. Over a period of time, I think this will drive US productivity growth up, but this is pretty much in the long term. Coming to India, in the 5 minutes that I have left, the Indian slowdown is a cyclical one. I think this is something that needs to be emphasized. We are not going to slow down strategically or structurally to a 5.5–6% growth rate. The reasons why we slowed down were 3. One was fiscal, second was monetary, and the third was regulatory. So on the fiscal side, I'll spare you the details on the left-hand side chart, but basically in the first 4 months of this fiscal year, the central government's fiscal deficit accumulation was well below the trend. So there was unintended, because of elections, fiscal tightening, which is now being relaxed. So I think that problem is slowly getting addressed. I don't think FY26 has a consumption stimulus. The government is still shrinking its footprint in the economy, which is the right thing to do. But I think the narrative around this having a massive consumption stimulus is something that is not theoretically correct. On the regulatory side, we are seeing several regulators pull back from being excessively tight and trying to micromanage and getting into prescription type regulation rather than principles-based regulation. So at the margin, we are starting to see that from a whole host of regulators. But on the monetary side, I think there is a problem. So what you see on the right is that credit growth fell very sharply. This was primarily because of the circular that was issued, where the regulator told the banks, some of the largest banks, that you have to bring down your loan deposit ratios. Now, when that happened, it created a downward spiral of credit growth. And this is something that needs to be reversed. The problem is that with the currency market volatility, the RBI is periodically, regularly having to sell dollars. In the process, it buys rupees and shrinks durable liquidity. What you see on the left is that durable liquidity as a percentage of deposits is now negative. These are very tight conditions, and there is a very high cost, 150 basis points. So therefore, the rate cuts are actually completely ineffective. So people keep demanding, oh, let's cut by another 25, let's cut by another 50. Frankly, those rate cuts are going to be totally ineffective till we get durable liquidity into the system. And this is something that needs to be addressed very quickly. I think the RBI, because of all the global volatility, may be a bit more cautious, and therefore the actual recovery in the economy may be several months away. But I think this process should start to happen. This is what I was pointing to. If you see on the left-hand side chart, this is the 4-month rolling currency intervention. The RBI had to sell $60 billion. Maybe in the Q&A, in the panel discussion, we can discuss the reasons for this, but this is something that caused a lot of durable liquidity to get sucked out. This needs to be re-injected. It is taking a lot longer than perhaps it should, but this is the process. So if once this starts getting done, I think that the economy will start to revive. This is the reason why I am convinced that we have a trend growth rate of about 7%. You break down into labor input, capital input, total factor productivity. In my view, labor can add about 1%. Total factor productivity can add about 1.5 to 2%. And capital formation, in my view, is going to accelerate. So what you see on the right is the investment to GDP ratio, which in 2012 was 34%, in 2021 was 27%. It has been rebounding since then. We think that it is going to rebound. And it is going to rebound because the decline, unlike all the narrative around private sector capex, was primarily because of real estate. So you can see that of the 7% point decline, 5% point decline came from the drop in household investments in dwellings. So the real estate cycle was one of the primary causes of the decline in investment activity. As it starts to recover, it will trigger capex in steel, in cement. Some of this we are starting to see, but there's a lot of downstream stuff that starts to get affected. On the machinery side, you can see how power sector capex, we were at one point adding 25, 30 gigawatts a year. This is something that has now fallen very significantly. A lot of the manufacturing decline, capex decline in manufacturing was in sectors that feed into real estate and in power generation. Both of these cycles are now starting to turn. So you can see on the right how the real estate launches have picked up. You can see on the left how the real estate sales have picked up in the top 8 cities. This is something that I think at a national level can be quite substantial. The last 2 slides are on markets. I will spare that because I'm sure we are going to hear from Prashant in much more detail. So my time's up. I'll wait for the panel discussion. Thank you for being a patient audience.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra, for sharing your insights and thoughts.